morning session is Ryan Adams. So Ryan did his PhD at Cambridge, and now he's another Cambridge assistant professor, or actually associate professor right at Harvard. He also spent some time at Twitter. So Ryan is well known for his work in Bayesian inference, and in particular, he's been doing a lot of interesting work in Bayesian optimizations. He's won a number of best paper awards and also the Sloan Fellowship. So that's welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Percy, and thanks for having me. So today what I want to tell you about is some ideas for taking advantage of structure in Bayesian optimization. So in some ways this is kind of a complement to the last talk, in which I'm going to be also talking about Gaussian processes as models for non-convex functions, but instead trying to think about how to take advantage of structure that we can build into these to solve different kinds of problems. And I thought I would start out by sort of giving you an idea of some of the kinds of problems that I care about and that I think of as being non-convex optimization problems that we can solve with techniques like this. And they're the kinds of things that get me excited. So to start off with, for the last couple of years, my group has been collaborating with chemists at Harvard to try to use machine learning to design new molecules. Okay, so in this case, organic molecules that are things like organic photovoltaics and organic light-emitting diodes. So to give you the big picture, we'd like to have sort of plastic solar cells to replace all of our rigid silicon-type solar cells, and then we could mold them in all kinds of shapes and print them on, roll-to-roll printing and so on. Silicon-type solar cells right now take something like 2 years to recover the amount of energy it took to produce them. In principle, we can make these things out of essentially plastic, except that we don't know about what molecules to use to make these kinds of things. Okay? Nevertheless, we can treat this, in my view, as an optimization problem in molecular space. Molecular space has something like 10 to the 60 different molecules in it, so it's very, very large and very highly structured. And the question is, can we, say, optimize something like the efficiency of these organic photovoltaic molecules subject to different kinds of constraints about longevity and synthesizability and so on. The other kinds of problems we've been working on that I, again, also think of as being kind of non-convex optimization problems include things like automatic hardware design. So part of the reason that we're seeing a lot of success in areas like deep learning is due to the development of very specialized pieces of hardware to do things like accelerate convolutional neural networks. And the question is, can we automatically design these kinds of things to satisfy the different constraints associated with mobile devices and embedded devices and so on? In particular, you could imagine trying to identify the Pareto front between things like, say, power consumption and the performance, or say the error that you're achieving on some problem that you care about, as well as things like the actual expense and the sort of chip area that you're trying to allocate. Again, I like to think of these as difficult optimization problems. At Twitter, and there's a couple of folks here in the audience who actually did this work, there's a lot of really big systems to serve you all these tweets. So Twitter is built on a very large scale what they call microservices. So these are lots of sort of servers, you can think of it little sort of daemons that run on top of the Java virtual machine across tens of thousands of machines. And they do all of the things from resolving a handle when somebody tweets to identifying what ads to show you when you go to your timeline. These things are very, very expensive, and the Java virtual machine, although it's great for a lot of things, is very complicated to tune because of garbage collection. That is to say that it protects you from having to allocate and deallocate memory, but it's but sort of getting that garbage collection right to achieve good performance can be very challenging. And engineers who even understand that system very well have a hard time identifying the correct regimes. Systematizing these kinds of problems through the lens of sort of non-convex optimization turns out to be able to yield very large gains, and we're talking about potentially sort of millions of dollars of capital expenses. And we have seen similar kinds of gains in tuning very large data processing jobs on systems like Hadoop. Other kinds of examples of things that I think of as being sort of within the space of non-convex optimization include trying to develop control systems for relatively sophisticated things like biomimetic robots. So Songbei Kim's lab at MIT builds things like this cheetah robot that you've seen here, and if you saw the amazing stuff that Boston Dynamics has been doing, you can appreciate that trying to get the control systems for these highly nonlinear systems right is its own sort of complicated challenge, and again, something that we might want to formalize and systematize as a non-convex optimization problem. And then finally, one of the things that sort of got us thinking about this is thinking about the tuning of machine learning algorithms. So a lot of the success of different kinds of machine learning algorithms has to do with the hyperparameters that are sitting on top. In the case of things like deep learning, that means all of the questions that you need to answer about learning rate and about widths of the layers and how big your mini batches are and so on. And getting those things right is important to success. It's often treated as a kind of a black magic type problem. And again, systematizing this as an optimization problem in terms of something like cross-validation performance seems to be the kind of the right way to handle this. And indeed, we often see that kind of systematization and optimization outperforms human experts in actually tuning these kinds of things. So, what's the kind of common theme across all of these different kinds of problems? In my view, they kind of are a little bit different from a lot of the other kinds of problems that we think about when we talk about non-convex optimization. In each of these cases, it's something that we can evaluate point-wise. That is, we can evaluate a molecule using density functional theory, or we can run a machine learning algorithm. But in general, we're not going to have access to other kinds of geometric information, in particular even just gradients to tell us what direction might be a good direction to go. And in particular, those point-wise evaluations are often going to be very, very expensive and possibly noisy, right? So to actually train one of these machine learning algorithms or to actually run a simulation on a molecule or a robot may be something that can take hours or days or even weeks. And so we want to be able to make really good decisions about what we're going to do when we evaluate a point in this space. Additionally, there may be constraints that we're not going to know a priori. That is, other surfaces and other things going on that are essentially introducing forbidden regions. And often we care about constant factors in these kinds of problems. So although we often like in general as a community we like to think in terms of sort of asymptotics and rates. In practice, for a lot of these kinds of problems, it really makes a difference if you can go a little bit faster or twice as fast to get a better answer. Like, it really does matter in terms of how many times you're going to get to look at it and look at the molecule. And so the point here is the question of how can we come up with a formalism that allows us to take advantage of structure and to sort of build in more knowledge into these kinds of problems. And the framework that I like for thinking about this is the idea of Bayesian optimization. So broadly speaking, Bayesian optimization is a way to reason about non-convex optimization where we're building a probabilistic model for the objective function that we're trying to minimize. So this is a model into which we can build as much prior information as we have available to us. Although a very nice way to reason about this is to come up with to use something like a Gaussian process that gives us a nice Bayesian non-parametric representation. But the point is, then as we encounter data, we're doing posterior updates that now allow us to incorporate that information into the model and represent both what we know and what we don't know about this function. And in things like Gaussian processes, we can then manipulate that model and turn it into some kind of utility, some kind of heuristic that allows us to essentially score different potential candidate next points to evaluate. And then hopefully, if we sort of choose a utility that's sensible, then we're going to make good decisions about the next molecule to try or the next robotic control system to evaluate. Okay, and there's a few different kinds of things out there. Ideas like expected improvement. From the bandit literature, there's like the upper confidence bound approach and sort of a few different ideas. I'm going to tell you a little bit about just the sort of expected improvement idea as one particular version of things. So this is the main idea. So let's imagine that there's some objective function we're trying to minimize that we don't have access to except pointwise. Perhaps we've seen a couple of evaluations. And the main idea here is that there's a whole set of functions that are going to be consistent with these observations, right? We have some sort of inductive bias for what these functions can be. Here, I'm using a Gaussian process that asks the functions to be very gradient smooth. But the point is, there's a very large number of functions that are consistent with these data. And the question is, how can we make decisions that are going to be good decisions on average under all of these possible functions, right? That's the name of the game, essentially. We like the Gaussian process for reasoning about this kind of thing because it allows us to be kind of clear about what our expectations are in terms of a variety of functional properties that we can express through kernels. So it's really just coming up with a sort of a basis function regression model, but with the property that that we don't necessarily have to commit ourselves to one finite basis. And for problems like this, it also has a very nice property that we get Gaussian marginal predictive distributions in closed form. So it's just kind of doing some linear algebra in order to be able to ask questions about points we haven't yet evaluated. So in particular, the Gaussian process allows us to think about these, a mean function that is sort of consistent with the data we've seen, as well as you can think of kind of probabilities of marginal excursions of the functions at any given point, right? So now if we want to treat this as, this kind of heuristic optimization, then we can reason about we can look at what our, say, current best point is and ask questions such as, what's the expected improvement as a function of a new location for some new evaluation? So this is essentially asking the question that if I was to evaluate this function pointwise at some new location, how much would I expect to improve over my existing best? Again, using these sort of marginal predictions under something like a Gaussian process. So we could take this proxy problem, which is hopefully much cheaper to evaluate than our original problem. It's still an annoying non-convex problem, and so this depends on being able to use all the amazing results from the rest of the talks on this workshop. But the point is, nevertheless, it is much cheaper to evaluate, and you have gradients and other kinds of geometric information about it. We take the best point according to the scoring, and then we go off and actually evaluate that point in our function space, perform the very expensive experiment, and then we perform a Bayesian update after we get the results of that. Okay? And so now, after this Bayesian update, we've learned something about our function, we've contracted some of the uncertainty in some of the different locations, and we can iterate this process. And there's different ways we can tackle this in parallel ways and so on. And so what we're doing is gradually going after points about which we're optimistic because they're currently kind of look like they might be near minima, as well as points that have high uncertainty because those are places where we might have we might expect to see some kind of good value. So this is just explore versus exploit. So this is kind of the name of the game for Bayesian optimization, broadly speaking. It's a way to take a prior and turn that into a procedure where you're chasing after points that you think are going to be, that you think are going to be good, where you get to define what that means. This kind of stuff has a very long history under a lot of different names, and there are people who've done a lot of work on this. I feel like this goes back to sort of the optimal design of experiments type literature, as well as, of course, response service optimization from statistics. And then it's been sort of very similar ideas have been invented under the names of like Lipschitzian optimization and knowledge grading and so on. Within the machine learning world, it also relates to ideas like active learning and Bayesian nonparametrics, of course, and it's very closely coupled to ideas from like the banded literature. And then there are some emerging theoretical results for this that I'm not talking about today. This is something that, even though it's quite kind of old, has also been seeing quite a lot of interest. I think for like a lot of other aspects of machine learning, as computers have gotten faster and problems have sort of identified themselves, then people have gotten excited about trying these different things in practice. So this is just a set of papers that I immediately saw from looking for the worst Bayesian optimization, just going to titles of papers, just to give you kind of a flavor that this is something people are thinking quite a lot about, it seems like. So what I want to talk about is kind of is why in practice this gets me, this sort of gets me excited, and why it's been successful on the different kinds of problems that I showed you there. It's fundamentally it's nothing magical, right? Like it's not, and there's no free lunch. It doesn't sort of like somehow get by the cursed dimensionality or anything. The main thing about Bayesian optimization, in my view, is that in practice we often know a lot about the problems that we're trying to solve. And I've shown very generic sort of function priors here, but most of the time we know things about the problem. And by using explicit Bayesian priors, it allows us to build in that knowledge to whatever degree we're comfortable with. If we're willing to make assumptions, then there's a very clear way to build that into a Bayesian optimization model, and then hope that our optimizations are going to go faster. Okay, and I thought what I would do is tell you about a couple of examples where we feel like this has been successful in identifying this kind of structure. One such example of this is just a really simple observation, which is that very often when you're solving one of these kinds of problems, it is not the only problem that you're going to solve, right? While it may be the case that solving this organic LED problem is something we would do in isolation, when you're tuning a complicated system in Twitter, you're probably not just tuning one such complicated system, but you're tuning many such systems, and in particular, their behavior is non-stationary, evolving over time. So you really have a large number of these problems that are closely related. And we could pretend like these are going to have wildly different objective functions, but of course, in practice, these are going to be often very related to each other, and we'd like to be able to take advantage of that. And this comes up in a lot of other kinds of different ways you can imagine. So, for example, thinking about different kinds of neural networks that you want to train on, say, different image data sets. Again, thinking about a place like Twitter, maybe on one hand, you're training a model that is trying to perform OCR on different tweets that have images of text, or maybe you're trying to perform some kind of image classification, or maybe you're trying to detect content that's not safe for work. These are different kinds of problems that we would expect to have different kinds of structure associated with natural images, but are nevertheless different problems. Similarly, one of the things that comes up a lot is that you would like to, at some point you're going to want to train the big model on all of your data if you're trying to solve some large-scale problem, but you're not going to get to be able to do that very often, probably. If you have some model that takes a week or two to train, it's not going to be the case that you can do that a large number of times to identify exactly what the right sort of regularization is to apply. But probably you can create a sequence of problems of different sizes where you can afford to run the small one maybe a large number of times. And what you might reasonably hope is that the problems will share structure across this space. And that you can take advantage of that by being able to sort of learn a lot using the cheap problems that carries over in an interesting way to the large problems. The way that we tackle this is frankly a not very complicated sort of thing. It's to observe that in the vanilla Gaussian process, what you have is a set of, is a prior on scalar functions, and we can instead define priors on vector functions. And the easiest way to do that is to expand our kernel function to not only include the sort of parameter space that we're optimizing, but also across the tasks that we're trying to solve. And this has the sort of simple effect that if we have a set of functions that we believe are dependent, if we pretended like they're independent, then we're going to wind up with a lot of uncertainty in areas where we haven't observed data. But if we know that if we're willing to model that dependence, then we're able to know a lot more about places we haven't been in, say, the expensive problem if we visited that in the cheap problem previously. This sort of, here, the idea of things like expected improvement has some subtleties that make it a little bit less appropriate, and so we often frame these in terms of information collection. So there's some very nice work by Philip Hiddick and colleagues on an idea called entropy search, where what we're trying to do essentially is build an estimator of where the location of the minimum of the function we care about is, and then we can frame this optimization problem as one of gathering bits about that location. And in the case of multitask optimization, this is very natural because there's a function you don't care about that you're minimizing, but it nevertheless gives you bits about the thing you do care about. Other ways you can imagine taking advantage of structure include things like looking kind of inside the box of the function that you're optimizing. So many of the kinds of problems that we're talking about here have the flavor that we're optimizing an outer loop, and the inner loop is itself something like stochastic gradient descent. So again, if you're training something like a deep neural network, then there's some sequence of sort of inner loop optimizations. You're looking at some training curve or perhaps some validation curve and hoping that's getting better over time. Humans can do this a lot faster in practice because they can look at the curve, they can look at the way, they can look at standard out as their TensorFlow is printing or whatever it is, and they can, and they'll hit Control C, right? They'll kill the job whenever it's clear that this is diverged or it's not doing something interesting. In general, something that is only dependent on the final result in an outer loop is not going to know about, is not going to know to Control C things. So the idea of freeze-thaw Bayesian optimization is that, and we call it freeze-thaw because you can imagine that we have a bunch of experiments that are in some state of partial completion, right? So they're in the freezer. And then we have some amount of computation that we can spend at any given moment. And the idea is that we pop these different sort of optimizations out, run them a little bit farther whenever we believe that this might turn out to be a good result. And so we can sort of allocate our resources to potentially completely new configurations, as well as spend more of our computation on old experiments. The part of the reason, part of sort of the ingredients to make this work is a kernel function, not just over the sort of the optimization surface that we care about, but that also accounts for the training curves themselves. And so this work introduces a kernel function that tends to produce these kind of monotonic curves that we feel like are good priors for the kinds of training curves that we often see in practice across a lot of these different kinds of sort of SGD type optimizations. So here's an example of kind of what a run of this might look like, where sort of closest to me here we have like epochs of training, so these are interloop things, and then as you're going sort of into the screen here, this is different sort of different iterations of the outer loop optimization. And the point here is that we're trying to actually model and then variously abort training curves, as it's clear that they're not going to be competitive with ones we already know about, but we nevertheless get information about the global structure. This is something that in practice helps a lot because there's a lot of bad configurations, and so if you discover those bad configurations and stop putting effort into them, then you're going to get to spend more time on the good configurations. So the last thing I want to talk about as an example of structure is something that I think is kind of a byproduct of different ways we've been thinking about these kinds of problems. So Gaussian processes are really very nice and very elegant, but they suffer from scalability issues in the sense that, at least naively, they require solving a linear system that scales with the number of data that you've seen before. And so if you want to look at a very large number of observations, then you're essentially looking at something that's roughly cubic. One of the ways we've been tackling this is by observing that, of course, Gaussian processes are just non-parametric nonlinear regression, or Bayesian nonlinear regression, and then we can also, but the sort of recent developments in Bayesian neural networks are also various kinds of Bayesian nonlinear regression, and that if these give us priors that we like for the kinds of problems we're trying to solve, then they have hopefully better scaling properties. And there's been quite a lot of work recently in thinking about how to do this kind of Bayesian neural network development. What's interesting from the point of view of thinking about structure is that they've been the ways in which these things have been particularly successful is by looking at invariances that can be applied to sort of everyday problems. So convolutional neural networks, the first order, are the things that really do work. We talk a lot about deep neural networks in other contexts, but most of the big ones that we've seen in practice have involved explicitly representing different invariances like translation invariance. And so in some other work, we, for example, have so this is with David Dubino and McLaurin. We've identified similar kinds of structures that we can take advantage of in graphs, and in particular graphs that correspond to molecular structures. And so then you can build deep neural networks for supervised problems using these kinds of sort of taking advantage again of this kind of structure. In this case, also motivated heavily by the success of different kinds of convolutional neural fingerprint, molecular fingerprints from the cheminformatics literature. And it turns out that you can sort of backprop into these kinds of structures, and much like the successes we've seen in different kinds of image recognition and speech recognition problems, we can get really good at predicting the properties of different kinds of molecules, including things like organic photovoltaics and drug candidates. So that doesn't sound very much like optimization, except that now if we can sort of turn that into a Bayesian problem, now we can take advantage of structure that's living inside of these molecules. Okay, so the things that it appears that deep learning is good at is identifying structure in the input space, right? You give it some invariances, but in particular, it's learning at the lower levels features that it can then compose later to create sort of very complicated things like we just saw in the last talk. In the case of things like molecules, that means discovering, for example, sort of features, sort of molecular features. These are like the filters that you might see if you looked at, like for the Bohr filters you might look at if you were solving a visual object recognition problem. Here on the left are things that are sort of filters that correspond to lack of solubility, or sort of solubility and sort of non-solubility on the right. And I'm not a chemist, but even I can see that the things on the left here are going to be polar, are going to be more likely to dissolve, and things on the right are sort of, you know, aromatic rings and so on, and are not going to have those properties. And we can do the same kind of thing by identifying structures that, for example, tend to lead to toxicity. So the reason that's cool is because then you can, now you get to take advantage of that you're, you know, these kind of things that you're getting in a supervised way, where now if you build a Bayesian neural network, then when you're trying to make decisions about what molecule to try next, then you're going to be making much better decisions. And from our point of view, in a large-scale screening project, such as this actual project that has been a 3-year collaboration with Samsung, we're actually able to improve the speed, the rate at which we are identifying these molecules. And in particular, in this case, and this is the kind of long-running project, these ideas have actually led to successful new devices. So we actually have discovered sort of molecules that in this case glow blue as actual organic LEDs. And so there was a Nature Materials paper that we published this past summer discussing these new materials and this pipeline that includes sort of Bayesian neural networks all the way up through actual synthetic chemists making these things and actual device physicists turning them into things that will actually look pretty when you apply current to them. So the takeaway from all this, I think at one level I showed you some different kinds of problems that maybe people don't often think of as non-convex optimization problems. But like a lot of machine learning, I think the biggest win, yeah, we can be very fancy with things, but the biggest win is often systematizing these things as a first step. I think anybody who's interacted and who's sort of like, let's say, traveled abroad, if you will, often encounters people who are excited about machine learning in their scientific domain or engineering domain. And the first thing they really need often is just linear regression. Right? And the same thing still holds true here in optimization, where I think the sort of formalism gives us a lot of the mileage. But what I really like about thinking about Bayesian optimization in particular is this ability to incorporate structure that we can discover from the scientific knowledge of the problem, or because of the fact that we're solving many problems across time. And it gives you a very clear way to transition from having relatively little knowledge, where you want a fully non-parametric model, to something where you have a lot of sort of physics, say, built into what's going on. And it allows us to be very clear about that. So I'll stop there. I showed you a lot of pictures of people, and so I want to make sure that they get the credit that's due to them. Thank you all for listening.
We have a little bit of time for questions. Anyone have a question?
Relation between various features in the input space, like when you shoot the molecules, these are the substructures. These are the relations that are existing among the various features of the input space. So, what should be the ideal architecture of the network that should be in place to discover such structures? For example, if I have a very small network, it may not be able to discover the true relations present in the input space. But if I have a very large network, it may discover noisy patterns. So that parameter still will be a tricky one.
Yeah, so this doesn't really bypass any of the issues that we have in fitting potentially complicated supervised learning models. I mean, at the end of the day, what we're doing is function approximation, where in this case, we're asking these complicated layered models to do the function approximation for us, and if we make them too big and we don't have enough data, then they're not going to be good just in the exact same way they are for other things. Here we have the advantage of already sort of doing this work to get good at that problem separately before we started treating it like an optimization problem.
Okay, I guess we're out of time, so let's thank Ryan again.